All right, get ready, because we are diving deep into the world of Indian politics today.
Sounds good to me.
You've brought some really interesting work from Laxmikanth, a political expert, and we're going to try to figure out just what makes this system work.
Yeah, it's a system that tends to surprise people,
Yeah.
especially folks who are used to a two-party structure,
Right.
like you see in some Western democracies.
Yeah. So first things first, what does this landscape look like? What would someone new to this, like me, immediately notice as different?
I'd say the sheer number of political parties is the first thing that really stands out.
Okay.
If you can imagine this, just before the 2019 elections, right, India had 7 national parties, 52 state parties,
Okay.
and over 2,000 registered but unrecognized parties.
Wow, over 2,000. That's not just a two-party system. That's a 2,000-party system. That's incredible.
A lot.
Yeah, and what's fascinating to me is what this says about India, about Indian democracy, why
Yeah.
so many parties.
Well, India's always been incredibly diverse,
Right.
and their political system really reflects that. Each party often represents a very specific identity, a certain ideology, or a particular regional interest.
So it's not just as simple as left versus right.
No, not at all. You're right. So while you have parties like the BJP and the communist parties that have very clear ideological stances,
Okay.
a lot of the others share pretty similar goals.
Okay.
And they often prioritize gaining power and forming alliances over sticking to a rigid ideological divide.
So it becomes more about maneuvering and strategy.
Exactly. And this fluidity, it leads to these alliances and strategies that are constantly in flux,
Wow.
which makes Indian politics incredibly dynamic.
Yeah.
It's like a game of chess, but in real life.
I can only imagine. I'm starting to understand how this complexity plays out.
Yeah.
But with so many different players, how do regional interests affect things at the national level?
That's where regional parties come in.
Okay.
Parties like the Shiromani Akali Dal, which represents Sikh interests, or the Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, the DMK, they're focused on Tamil identity.
Okay.
And both of these illustrate how specific cultural identities and very localized regional issues can carry a lot of weight in national politics.
So even if they aren't trying to lead the entire country, they can still have a big impact.
Absolutely. And that makes understanding their motivations and their influence absolutely critical to grasping the nuances of Indian politics.
Yeah.
It's not enough to look at the national players.
Right.
You have to understand the regional ones too.
Like you
Bob.
need a course in it or something. Oh, wait, that's what we're doing.
I guess so.
Okay,
That's right.
let's take a quick break and we'll come back to this fascinating world of Indian politics. So many parties and such a diverse population. I can only imagine what election season must be like in India.
Oh, it's really something else. You've got a country with over 900 million eligible voters spread across this vast and varied landscape,
Yeah.
all going to the polls. It's a huge logistical challenge.
Yeah, it's hard to even wrap my head around that scale. So how does India even begin to make sure those elections are fair and efficient with that many people participating?
Well, that's where the Election Commission of India comes in.
Okay.
There's this independent body, and they're responsible for running elections at both the national and state level.
Okay.
And they have a lot of authority to make sure things are free and fair.
So they're like the referees
Yeah.
making sure everybody's playing by the rules.
Exactly. They handle everything,
Okay.
from registering voters and nominating candidates to setting the election schedule and making sure the voting process itself is secure.
Wow. So with such a massive, complicated undertaking, what does an election actually look like on the ground?
Picture this. Vibrant rallies with these passionate speeches, catchy slogans everywhere you look,
Oh, yeah.
colorful posters all over the place,
Right.
and candidates going literally door to door to connect with voters personally.
It's amazing how those campaigns have to adapt to reach people in such a diverse country.
Absolutely. And geographically massive, too, right?
Right.
I mean, take the largest and smallest Lok Sabha constituencies in the 2014 elections, for example.
Okay.
The largest one, Malkajgiri in Telangana, had something like 3 million voters.
3 million.
That's more than some countries.
That's mind-boggling. And what about the smallest one?
The smallest, Lakshadweep, had less than 50,000.
Wow.
Can you imagine the different strategies you'd need to reach voters in those two completely different settings?
That's a huge difference.
It really shows how adaptable and resourceful Indian politicians have to be.
It sounds like a crash course in political campaigning. But beyond the spectacle and the campaigning,
Yeah,
are there actual laws that provide a framework for this huge electoral system?
absolutely, yeah. The Representation of the People Act, which they first enacted back in 1950,
Okay.
that's like the cornerstone of Indian elections.
Oh, okay.
It covers everything from getting those electoral rolls ready
Right.
to figuring out the boundaries of constituencies to even regulating campaign finances.
So it's like the rule book,
Yeah.
making sure there's some kind of order and fairness.
Exactly. And it changes over time, too, to reflect the changing political landscape. Like when they introduced electronic voting machines, for example, that was a big deal.
Oh, yeah. In a country with that many voters, that must have been huge.
Hugely important for making voting easier and more accurate.
Right.
And then there's the Delimitation Act of 2002,
Okay.
which is crucial for making sure representation is actually fair.
Tell me more about that. How does that work?
Basically, it adjusts the electoral boundaries
Okay.
based on how populations change. Because a fast-growing city is going to have different needs in terms of representation than, say, a rural area where the population's going down.
Right.
Without delimitation, you could end up with really unbalanced representation.
So it's about making sure that a vote in one part of the country carries the same weight as a vote somewhere else.
Exactly. That's a really important part of making sure things are fair in a democracy, as diverse and geographically spread out as India.
With a system like that in place, are there people working on refining it even more?
Oh, absolutely. India is constantly trying to strengthen its democratic institutions. I mean,
Yeah.
there have been so many committees over the years to address different electoral challenges,
Wow.
like campaign finance reform, voter education, and just getting more people out to vote. It really shows how committed India is to constantly evaluating and improving its democracy.
Right. So we've talked about the parties and the rules, but what about the voters themselves? With such diversity, I can't imagine there's one simple answer for why Indians vote the way they do.
You're totally right. It's really a mix of so many different things. Socioeconomic conditions, religious and cultural identities,
Right.
local issues, what's going on nationally, they all play a part. Caste, class, community affiliations, alongside, how people see the candidates in their parties.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that things are so much more complex than just looking at demographics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But on top of that, you can't forget the influence of the media.
Right.
Especially during elections. Government platforms like All India Radio and Doordarshan are so important for getting information out there and making sure all the parties have an equal chance.
It's about fairness and access to information, especially when it really matters.
Exactly. Transparency and accountability are key. Now, with so many parties all competing, I'm curious, how often does one actually win a majority?
That's what I was wondering. It seems almost impossible with so many parties in the running.
You're right to think that. Coalition governments have become really common in Indian politics.
Okay.
It's pretty rare for a single party to get a clear majority in the Lok Sabha, which means they need to form alliances to govern.
So you have all these parties, sometimes with different priorities, having to work together.
That's
How does
it.
that even work?
It creates a really interesting dynamic. Like, take the 1996 United Front government, for instance. There was a coalition of 13 different parties.
Oh, 13.
And they actually managed to get some big economic reforms done, even with all their differences.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, coalitions can be pretty fragile. That same United Front government, it fell apart after just 2 years because of internal conflicts.
It's a real balancing act then. It requires compromise and collaboration,
Yeah,
but it could all fall apart pretty easily.
exactly. And it's not even just the political parties that are involved. You've got pressure groups too, like trade unions or business organizations, and they have a big influence on policy.
So it's this whole chorus of voices trying to shape what the government does.
Yeah, it's really a testament to how dynamic and multifaceted Indian democracy is.
It really is. And that makes me think about the challenge of keeping a country so diverse unified. What's being done to deal with issues like communalism and casteism and all those different ideologies?
India recognizes that national integration is something you have to constantly work at.
Right.
The National Integration Council, which they set up in 1961, that brings together leaders from tons of different backgrounds to figure out how to strengthen unity and tackle these divisive issues.
So it's about creating a dialogue to try and bridge those gaps?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's recognizing that unity takes real effort, a commitment to finding common ground.
Which brings us to the foundation of it all, the Indian Constitution.
Right.
How does that work in this really complex landscape?
It's an incredible document. It sets up how the government works. It guarantees fundamental rights.
Okay.
And it lays out the powers of all the different institutions.
It's like the blueprint for how Indian democracy is supposed to function.
Exactly. And the really interesting thing is it's not set in stone. It's been amended a bunch of times since 1950
Oh, wow.
to reflect how the country's needs and goals are always changing.
So it can adapt while staying true to its core values.
Exactly. Like in 2000, they established the National Commission to review the working of the Constitution.
Okay.
And their whole job was to look at how effective it was and suggest changes for the 21st century.
Makes sense.
That shows how committed they are to making sure the Constitution is still relevant today.
So it's all about keeping the system healthy and making sure it still works.
Yeah, exactly. And another crucial part is how they handle amendments. It's about finding that balance between being able to adapt and staying stable.
Right.
Like there's this landmark case, Kesavananda Parati, back in 1973, and it established this thing called the Basic Structure Doctrine, which basically says you can't amend the Constitution in a way that violates its fundamental principles.
So even Parliament has some boundaries. They can't just change anything.
Exactly. That's what's so important about checks and balances. No one group has absolute power.
Wow, that was quite a journey. We covered so much, from the huge number of parties to how elections work,
Yeah, it's a lot.
the challenges of coalition governments, all the way to how the Constitution tries to hold it all together.
Yeah, and we're just scratching the surface.
It seems like understanding Indian politics is an ongoing process.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
But the more you learn, the more you see how dynamic and resilient India is. It's a real testament to democracy in action, even with all its complexities.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We only explored a small part of this, but hopefully it gives you a starting point to learn even more about this fascinating democracy. There's always more to discover.